I'd like to acknowledge the contribution that Indigenous Australians hold to country and culture, and particularly in this time of great uncertainty. So the purpose of our session is to inform you of our role in regulating unbooked taxi fares and our processes, to provide you an overview of our draft decision, critically to hear what you think of our draft decision, and to make sure that your views are considered as we move to making our final decision. Attending from the Essential Services Commission, other than myself, are the Director of Price Monitoring and Regulation, Marcus Crudden, the Senior Regulatory Manager, Craig Madden, Project Manager, Jonathan Roberts, and Sonia Madamba, and taxi team staff. So you also have an opportunity, other than in this webinar, to provide written feedback. So even after today's forum, there is an opportunity for further engagement with us. Submissions to our draft decision are due on the 31st of July, and the best way to submit a written response is via the Engaged Victoria website at engage.vic.gov.au, or otherwise you can contact us by email at transport@esc.vic.gov.au, and we're really keen to get your input. So the logistics for today's virtual public forum, as I indicated earlier, this is a public forum, and as such, please be aware it's being recorded so that others may have access to view it. This means the recording will be placed on the Commission's website in the future. So to facilitate today's session, if you could put your microphone on mute and turn off the video, and then you can unmute your microphone and turn on your camera when you're invited to speak or ask a question. The mute function and the camera should be in the menu at the bottom of your screen. You can participate in two ways. You can ask a question orally by clicking the raise your hand function, and then we'll call on you to speak, or you can type your question using the chat function on Zoom. If you're calling in via a phone rather than on a laptop or an iPad, you'll be given a time to ask a question or make a comment. The agenda for today is broadly the following. First, I'll outline our role as Victoria's economic regulator and our role in the commercial passenger vehicle industry. Then I'll invite Sonia to provide an overview of our draft decision. And finally, I'll open up the forum to a question and answer session. So about the Essential Services Commission. So we're Victoria's independent economic regulator of the electricity and gas sectors, water and sewerage, and the transport sector. We also administer local government rate capping and the Victorian Energy Upgrade Scheme. Our overarching objective is to promote the long-term interests of Victoria's consumers. And within the transport sector, we monitor the Port of Melbourne's compliance with the price through price setting regulation. We set some prices for the commercial passenger vehicle industry, and we also set prices for the accident towing industry. Now, the Parliament gave us the role of setting maximum fares for unbooked commercial passenger vehicles. And the Parliament has also determined that our role should also be in setting the maximum non-cash payment surcharge for commercial passenger vehicles and to making recommendations to the Minister on the commercial passenger vehicle levy. So they're the functions the Parliament's given us. As a result, we do not regulate the following. We do not set fares for booked commercial passenger vehicle services. Not all stakeholders may be aware of this, but booked service providers can actually set their own fares as per the Commercial Passenger Vehicle Industry Act. And importantly, we do not set taxi drivers' income. A taxi driver's income is driven by the level of demand for booked and unbooked journeys, the supply of vehicles, and the share of the fare box that's retained by the driver, none of which we regulate. And we also do not regulate fares for unbooked commercial passenger vehicle services in the country zone. So the Parliament's given us a set of important but constrained functions to regulate, but there are other important areas of the sector that we do not control or regulate. So we're required under legislation to review the maximum fares for unbooked taxis no later than 2 years after a price determination is made. Now, our last price determination was made in October 2018. Now, we recognise the market for commercial passenger vehicles has evolved substantially since then, including due to technology such as the prevalence of smartphones and booking apps, which has increased the number of pre-booked trips, which we do not regulate, And due to changes in vehicle technology, such as hybrid vehicles have become much more prevalent. So this current review will set the maximum fares for unbooked taxi service that will apply from the 1st of October 2020. But also, since the last fare review and in going into this review, we'll all be very aware of the challenges of COVID-19. So we understand that commercial passenger vehicle industry service providers, including people who are booking service providers, meter providers, all of the people in the supply chain and their customers are currently dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. We've sought and received feedback from stakeholders on the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on their business. And we've considered the potential impact of the coronavirus pandemic on the industry and customers in forming our draft decision. We've been particularly mindful also not to impose extra administrative and implementation burdens, such as collecting large amounts of data from industry participants and updating meters and stickers, all the other things that would be required on unbooked taxi service providers in these challenging times. We've been very mindful of those impacts. So, with that introduction, I'll move on to our draft decision. I'll now invite Sonia to briefly discuss our draft decision, and then we can accept questions during the presentation and respond during the question and answer session at the end. So as Sonia speaks, if you've got any questions, put it in the chat function or raise your hand and we'll proceed through that. If we're unable to respond today to any of your questions, we'll take them on notice and provide a response with the presentation slides, which will be made available on our website. So over to you, Sonia.
Okay, thank you, Simon. I'll just fix my screen too. Okay, thanks again, Simon. Before I start, I'd like to say good afternoon to everyone, and thanks again for joining us. For today, I'll give you an overview of the Commission's draft decision. So as Simon has said, we are reviewing the maximum fares that would apply for unbooked taxi services from 1 October 2020. These fares apply to unbooked taxi services that begin in the Melbourne metropolitan zone and urban and large regional zone. Now, if you notice, we refer to unbooked commercial passenger vehicles as unbooked taxis in our review. And that is because unbooked taxis currently meet the requirements to provide unbooked commercial passenger vehicle services. However, we do acknowledge that other CPVs that meet the regulatory requirements in the future can also provide unbooked services. Now, our role for setting the maximum fares is governed by two legislations: the Commercial Passenger Vehicle Industry Act 2017 and the Essential Services Commission Act 2001. When we make decisions on maximum fares, our objectives are to promote the efficient provision and use of commercial passenger vehicles and to promote the long-term interests of Victorian consumers. The Commission must also have regard to a range of matters under the ESC Act and the Transport Integration Act 2010. Now, the next slide shows the Commission's process for reviewing maximum fares. So during a price review, we released 3 papers. First is the consultation paper at the start of the review. We then release a draft decision paper, and then the final decision paper at the end of the review. So we seek stakeholder feedback on our consultation paper and draft decision paper, and we give stakeholders a month to provide their feedback or submission. Now, after a public consultation on our draft decision, we normally release a final decision after 2 months or 2.5 months. Now, for this current review, we just like to note that we have received 15 submissions, written submissions from stakeholders, and we had meeting with around 5 stakeholders, one-on-one meetings with them. Now, our draft decision. So the Commission's draft decision is to keep maximum fares for unbooked taxi services unchanged and to allow the use of time and distance tariffs to remain optional. In forming our draft decision, the Commission has considered a number of factors. First are the objectives and matters we must have regard to under the legislation, industry developments such as ongoing changes in consumer demand for CPVs, service levels, the impacts of the pandemic on the industry and consumers, and supply of commercial passenger vehicles. We also looked into the cost of providing taxi services since the last fare review in 2018, including new costs on unbooked taxi service providers as a result of their safety obligations. And last but not least, stakeholders' feedback. So why fares should remain unchanged? Now, unlike in the previous reviews where we have detailed information on trips taxi trips, we don't have that information for this review. However, available information suggests that there is no shortage in taxi supply. So generally in a market where there is no shortage in supply, we would not expect prices to go up. Again, available information and service level shows that the quality of taxis has generally improved. This suggests that the current maximum fares provide sufficient incentives to improve or maintain the quality of service provided. The Commission has been mindful that the pandemic has significantly affected both the industry and consumers. We estimated the cost of operating taxis may have fallen by 0.5% from March 2018 to March 2020, while total cost of providing taxi services, including an allowance for potential driver earnings, could have increased by 2.1%. However, due to the pandemic, there are some indications costs may have further decreased when we released our final decision in September. Any decrease in cost resulting from the coronavirus pandemic are, however, potentially temporary, and if incorporated into the maximum fares, may have an adverse effect on the industry's financial viability. This outcome is not in the long-term interest of Victorian consumers. Stakeholders' views are mixed. Some said fares should increase to improve drivers' earnings, while others said that it should remain the same given the pandemic. We note that increasing fares to offset driver income losses resulting from oversupply and increased competition in the industry would not be consistent with our objectives. Undertaking a market outcomes approach and a review of the cost basket would have been ideal, but they would impose additional administrative burdens to the industry in these challenging times, and we are mindful not to do that. So the next slide is our draft decision meeting our objectives. So the Commission considers that our approach of considering those different factors informing our draft decision best meets our legislative objectives and requirements. Overall, the Commission considers that consumers and the unbooked taxi industry will be better off if we keep maximum fares unchanged. Given the impact of the pandemic and the uncertainty of its future impact, our draft decision will provide some level of stability for consumers and the unbooked taxi service providers. We have also been mindful, as mentioned by Simon, not to impose administrative and implementation burdens, such as collecting large amounts of data from industry participants and updating meters and stickers in these challenging times. And finally, we'd also like to note the 22 million financial boost for taxis and CPVs announced by the government last week. The pandemic has affected both the industry and the consumers, including the vulnerable ones. Both will benefit from this financial assistance and our draft decision to keep fares unchanged. So
Sonia?
the last slide is really about the key issues raised by stakeholders. So as I've said earlier, we received submission from 15 stakeholders. We have addressed the key issues they raised in our draft decision paper, but we thought we'll share with you some of the key issues today. So the first one is fares.
Sonia, sorry, it's Craig here. We have Colin from Bendigo Taxis wants to ask a question in relation to costs. So Colin, if you can just unmute yourself and ask your question, and then I'll address that to the appropriate person.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Just in relation to the costs decreasing, what consideration was given to the fact that the costs, whereas historically they have been able to be shared across 2 and sometimes 3 shifts per vehicle, are now only shared across 1 shift, which is what most of the vehicles are running now due to the the huge increase in numbers and reduction in drivers.
Jonathan, if you're there, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to answer that, Craig. So, look, I think that what you're referring to there, Colin, is the large increase in the supply of taxis and the impact that that's having on operator and driver incomes. Is that correct?
Well, essentially, the cost of the vehicle used to be able to be shared across 2 or 3 shifts per day. And now that cost, it has to be taken up through 1 shift only. Things like insurances, registration, all the normal costs that you would get a much larger return from are now only being done across 1 shift for most days.
Yes, but so what I'm trying to say is are you saying that that's what's driving that? Has it been what's driving the fact that there's only 1 shift being driven now? Is that because there's fewer drivers, or is that because there's more taxis on the road, or is it because there's less demand? What's driving that, Colin?
But it was more about what consideration to the cost, because when you made your decision, the statement was made that the costs have come down, but in real terms, have they? Because the ability to shift that cost across multiple shifts is not there. And why the shifts are not there almost becomes an irrelevancy.
Look, I would disagree with you saying that the cause of there only being 1 shift being irrelevant to the question. So from our perspective, what we're interested in is at the total level, what's been happening to costs. So it's not how you're allocating costs to shifts, it's what are the total costs. So from my perspective, what you're talking about is, this is me just interpreting what you're asking and also what we've observed. So what you're talking about is the fact that now there are more taxis around and there's more people, more drivers, driving for rideshare. And as a result of that, you're not able to, double or triple shift vehicles anymore. And so what's actually driving that is an increase in supply. So if we were to, increase fares in response to that, or say that costs have increased because you're now collecting those costs through a small number of shifts, that would be the same as us increasing fares to address an oversupply issue, which, as Sonia mentioned earlier, wouldn't really change, wouldn't really serve our objectives. So unless, you think that the reason that you're not double shifting anymore is for some other reason, I think that we would say that we don't actually think that that means that costs have increased. It just means that you're doing fewer shifts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
You just don't
so
agree, which is fine.
So in a sense, yeah, no allowance is made for it, and you've explained why you think that's appropriate. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you, Colin. Good question, though.
Just before we go on, Sonia, David Samuel also has his hand raised. Please go ahead, David.
Oh, thanks, guys. Thanks, Craig. Jonathan, I think what Colin's getting at there is that if we look at our immediate context, those prices, those costs that the industry face may well have declined by that 0.5% over the last 12 months. But revenue in the taxi now has declined far further than that, by probably up to 70%, depending on where you're situated really in the state. So while those costs might have declined, revenue has declined far further because of this unique environment we find ourselves in. Well, we hope it's unique anyway, and it goes away very quickly. So I think probably costs to industry don't carry the same weight they would have carried in the past because the revenue has been so badly affected by something out of all of our controls. If I'm not right, Colin, by all means correct me, but I think the reason for the huge decrease in demand for the service has nothing to do with competition or the number of available cars. The number of available cars is actually is actually moving, unfortunately for us, with demand, because we're seeing our fleets reduce quickly. And in Victoria, obviously I have that unique ability to look across the country at different fleet sizes because of our company's profile. And Victoria is now clearly the hardest hit because of the second wave of COVID. So I think what Colin's probably getting at is that costs don't at the moment have as big a determinant on the viability of the service as it would in a normal operating environment.
Yeah, no, look, that's a good point, David, and we are aware of the fact that demand has decreased significantly as an impact of the restrictions in Victoria. However, considering that hopefully these restrictions are going to be temporary, I think that, and our decision is going to be applying from October this year, making an adjustment to fares to account for that, hopefully temporary situation might not be the best way to go about things. However, one thing that we would be interested in hearing from stakeholders is, how we should maybe consider these impacts in our next fare review, or, how to deal with some of this uncertainty in the determination that we'll be making in September. So anyway, it's an important issue, and it's one that we're continuing to think about, and we'd encourage stakeholders to make submissions on.
No more questions for the moment, Sonia?
Okay, so I think just a few more. So in terms of the three issues, fares, the first one is, fares should increase to improve drivers' earning. And as Simon has explained, we do not set drivers' income, and increasing fares offset the driver income losses resulting from oversupply and increased competition would not be consistent with our objectives. So the second issue is the current taxi cost index being outdated, and most taxis being hybrid vehicles. So this may have increased or decreased cost, but we do not know by how much at this stage, given that we do not have the information. However, we acknowledge this concern, and we will consider this in our future fare reviews. In the meantime, and for the current review, we note that we use the cost index as an approximate indication of how costs have changed since our last fare review in 2018, and it is only one of the factors we have considered informing our draft decision. So the third issue is fares should be adjusted by CPI. We acknowledge that this approach is simpler and easier to administer. However, our concern with the use of CPI is that it is not as reflective of the cost of providing taxi services as the taxi cost index. So that is a brief overview of our draft decision. Hope the information are helpful. I will now give the floor to Simon for the Q&A session.
So, Craig, you were going to, I think in the first instance, Marcus was going to address some of the questions that we'd got prior to the forum.
Correct. So if we can just go to the first question there, which should be coming up on the screen. And that's Marcus. If you could focus on this question, which is, can the Commission explain why we regulate only a small percentage of the CPV market and what value this brings to the public?
Yeah, I think as both Simon and Sonia noted in their presentations, that government makes the policy decisions about what is regulated and what is unregulated in this market. For the moment that the unbooked fares have been left within a regulated environment, this is ultimately a policy call of government, and if people think it should be an entirely deregulated market, then it's really a issue that needs to be taken up with the government, not with us as regulators. We have to, as implied by the legislation, make a decision within each 2-year period as to what will be the maximum prices. In terms of the value it brings to the public, I think in terms of the unbooked fares, I think it does provide certainty to a passenger when hailing a cab on a street or approaching a cab rank, as to that there's consistency around the fare that will be charged. There's consistency between cabs within that rank if someone's approaching it, that someone doesn't have to go and knock on each cab window and ask. Why increasingly people are booking taxis through applications online. We should also be mindful there are parts of the population that may not have access to smartphones and the like. So this provides, I guess, a certainty in part of the market that anyone hailing a cab on the street or approaching a cab rank can have, that there's a fair, consistent, transparent price being charged. For the moment, I think it does bring value, but it is ultimately a policy consideration. If people think we should move away from regulation of these areas, it'll be a question for government, not us.
Thank you, Marcus. If we move on to the second question, and it's about why only unbooked and not booked fares regulated by the Commission. Again, Marcus?
Again, it's very similar answer to the first question, that it's the areas government has chose to be regulated. I think the view when the last review of the legislation occurred was that competition amongst commercial passenger vehicle providers had occurred in the booked market, and customers, I guess, could choose to book with one of a number of providers and could actually compare fares before making those bookings. The complication in the unbooked market is if you hail a taxi in the street and enter the cab, it's a bit late to start negotiating the price. So a regulated price was kept for that unbooked component.
Thank
I
you,
think it's Craig on those.
Thank you. Third question we've got, which I'll read out, is why was there not a separation of urban and metro areas, or does the ESC believe these areas to be subject to exactly the same costs and market forces? It comes from Bendigo Taxis. Jonathan, if you'd like to address that one.
Yep, sure. Happy to, Craig. So I think this is another question from you, Colin. So thank you for that. So I think what you're asking about here is why we've got the same, only got one cost stack in our decision as opposed to a separate one for the metro zone and the urban and large regional zone. So stop me if I'm wrong, Colin. I'm very happy for you to interrupt me while I'm responding to this. So basically the short answer is we don't think that they're the same, and in an ideal world we'd have a separate index for the two of them. But back in 2014 when we established the cost index, we got a relatively small number of responses for the urban and large regional zone to the survey that we sent out asking people about their costs. And the responses that we did get suggested that there weren't significant cost differences between the two areas. You know, obviously at that time there was still, you know, licensing costs, so that aside. So, you know, what we did see was that there were differences, but there are a lot of important similarities as well. So when we started this review, you know, we asked stakeholders how they thought that we should approach this review and assessing the level of fares. And one of the, you know, options that we proposed was reassessing the cost stack. We decided not to do that for a number of reasons. So one of those was just that cost changes that we're seeing at the moment reasonably volatile and, you know, might not reflect changes in costs going forward. And also there's a lot of uncertainty about where costs are going to be, you know, when we do finish this review. So we decided not to make any changes until there was a little bit more certainty about the direction of costs and a little bit more stability in changes. There was also another, you know, quite important reason as to why we didn't go out and, you know, re-examine the cost index or potentially re-establish new ones. And that's because, you know, we didn't want to go out there and require taxi operators to fill out a whole bunch of forms and provide us with a bunch of information if they've got more important things to do at the moment, like, you know, making sure that their businesses are running as well as they can during the pandemic. So I think that's why we don't have a separate urban and large regional zone and metro zone cost index for the moment. I hope that I've answered your question. Was that the kind of question that you had in mind, Colin, or were you talking about having a separate decision on what we would do for fares?
A little bit of both, but it's just also when measuring taxi service quality, how it's improved in the metro area. I would suggest there's been a disimprovement in the urban areas, but then you get into what service quality are you mentioning, and it's not unusual to get a couple of complaints from customers that drivers did not stop to pick them up when they were trying to hail them. Now, as fares start to separate and diverge away from each other, as in booked and unbooked, the issue of people trying to get an unbooked fare will become even harder. Obviously, that's not happening in the metro area, but in the country area, it's not going to be long before drivers are exclusively doing booked work only.
Yeah, look, so that's a good point, Colin. The measures of service quality that we have are probably heavily determined by what's going on in the metro zone, because, you know, in terms of having an objective or close to measure of service quality, really what we're kind of left with is customer complaints and the service quality index that that CPVV do. So, you know, if you've got a concern or you feel that service quality is decreasing in the urban and large regional zone, what would be really good evidence to help demonstrate that is if you had, you know, numbers on customer complaints and, you know, how those were changing over time, whether you're seeing an increase in them or not for your particular network. And, you know, if you wanted to make a submission to us on that would, you know, be useful for us to better understand how service quality is changing in the urban and large regional zone.
Thanks, Jonathan. If we move on now to the final question that we had prior to this seminar starting, and it's how many taxi fares in Victoria have increased in the last 3 years and by how much? And that comes from the Latrobe Valley Taxi Company. Jonathan?
Yep, I'm happy to answer this one, Craig. So, look, the short answer to that is I don't know, and I couldn't say. So in the metro zone and the urban and large regional zone, taxi fares have not increased. However, for areas that we don't regulate, the regional and country zones, I just couldn't say. So prior to 2017, we had a role monitoring taxi fares right across Victoria. But then in 2017, there was some changes to the Commercial Passenger Vehicle Industry Act, which meant that we no longer have a role in monitoring taxi fares in the regional and country zone. It's now Commercial Passenger Vehicles Victoria who's responsible for monitoring fares. So yes, if you have any questions about that, I encourage you to talk with Commercial Passenger Vehicles Victoria.
Thanks, Jonathan. Just following up on your response a moment ago about service quality, Tony Peters from Transport Alliance wants to ask a follow-up question about service quality. So, Tony? Tony, if you're there, feel free to ask your question about service quality.
Thank you. I think it's working now. Thank you, Craig. You said that the service quality data that you based the outcomes on was supplied to you by the CPVV. But tell me, where are they getting their information from?
My understanding is that they do a monthly survey asking consumers about their experiences with taxis.
The latest I heard is that they're not asking consumers about it and that they haven't been receiving many calls at all regarding problems because the passengers, the public are so used to now talking directly to the booking service providers that they don't even go via the CPVV. I just query the fact that you're relying on that information from the CPVV, which I don't think would be correct. I think it's information that you should be getting directly from the booking service providers.
Right. So what you're saying is that you think that we should be contacting booking service providers to ask them for customer satisfaction information or complaints numbers. Is that correct?
Indeed, yes. CPVV is not collecting that information from the BSP. Colin, David, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe they're collecting that information. It's certainly what we've been given to understand from regular meetings that we've been having with the CPVV. You also said that they are responsible for monitoring the fares in the urban and regional area. Again, I've asked that question of the CPVV and they say they don't have any idea as to what fares are doing in those areas. They don't know whether they've gone up or down or stayed the same.
Yes. Well, again, there's nothing that I can do about them and their fare monitoring role. But I will investigate what you're saying about the service quality data. And, you know, if what you're saying is correct, I completely agree. We should be correcting booking service providers directly to collect that information. But again, there's a question for them if, you know, they want to provide that information to us instead of focusing on their services during the pandemic. Like, I mean, we don't mind collecting the information, but do they want to go through the trouble of providing that to us at the moment? That's an open question, but it's something that we can investigate. So thank you for bringing that to our attention.
You also said that there was other data, no, it wasn't you, it was Sonia who said that there was data that they did not wish to request from the BSP because they didn't want to put any more onerous tasks on them just at this point in time. But perhaps that other data that they might have been wanting to request, CPVV does have that data. They have been collecting some, just not in the areas that you are saying that you have got information from. So data is as per the number of trips that have been done and the number of fares that have been done, which are very, very small, 70 to 80% decrease since COVID has hit us. But CPVV does have that information.
Yes, we've been exploring collecting information from CPVV on trip numbers and so forth. And yes, it's an ongoing process.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Jonathan, I just want to add additional information in relation to the question raised by Tony. I'd just like to note that we actually have information on the number of complaints for 2019, but we didn't use it for exactly that same reason. The CPV information in terms of complaints, they are actually incomplete because most of them are now lodged with BSP. So that's the reason why we did not include the 2019. But going forward, I agree that the number of complaints should be coming from PSPs and not CPVP.
Thank you, Sonia. We have David Samuel has raised his hand to ask a question. Please ask your question, David.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, just following off what Sonia said, just for clarity, so Jonathan doesn't have to run around trying to figure that out. Yeah, basically, if we provide what are called notifiable instances to the regulator, so if something goes wrong within a certain sort of range of events, then we'll provide them with that information. But that relates to safety issues, not service quality issues. So as Sonia said, those issues sit with us for us to resolve with our teams and deal with those customers. CPVV see their role as being a safety regulator. And I agree with Sonia that moving forward, I think you'll see them getting less and less of that. That's something we're happy about. We want to deal with our customers one-on-one. We don't think we need a regulator to deal with why a taxi didn't turn up, because ultimately the customer will use another service provider if we don't live up to those expectations. So I think I don't know where that information that CPV have given you has come from, but certainly we only provide data on those sort of very specific instances where there's been a breach of someone's safety, be that a driver or a passenger.
Thank you, David. Are there any more questions?
Good question of David. Is that all right in the format?
Yeah, go ahead, Simon.
David, prior to COVID, so up till January, were you seeing any pattern in the number of complaints you're getting going up or down? Because I'm assuming the question earlier was suggesting that there might have been a rise in complaints and therefore a need for higher fares. But have you observed any pattern in the change in complaints?
I think that's certainly, Simon, we haven't seen much of a change at all. If anything, a decrease in complaints in our fleet, and I can only obviously speak on behalf of 13 Cabs.
Yep.
So we've seen decreases over time. Even the most interesting result was when they removed mandatory training requirements, we saw a larger decrease in those things because we were able to train the drivers more specifically in certain areas the consumers were concerned about. In terms of COVID-19 and in terms of that, when you're talking about the need to adjust fares, the complication I think becomes if you put your booked fare up, but not your rank and hail fare, you will direct customers to the cheaper price and drivers to the higher price. So you can create a bit of an anomaly there. At 13 Cabs, we have the policy decision that we keep the two the same, so that we don't create those perverse incentives around the fare. I think in country areas like where Colin is, you've probably seen a greater shift in those greater change in those areas, but not so much with us. I think our complaint rates have remained fairly static. COVID's thrown all up in the air. Now we've got issues with contact centre staffing, things like that mean we've got longer wait times on the phone, believe it or not, because we've had to stand down staff, things like that.
Right.
But generally speaking, Simon, I think that the complaint rate overall in the last 2 years has come down. For our company, as I say, I can't speak on behalf of others.
Yeah. And the challenge with particularly complaint data from industry sources is there may be some inconsistencies across firms in terms of exactly how they classify them, because as you say, it's service quality issues rather than compliance issues.
That's exactly right. And I don't really see that, my personal view is that the ESC would, you know, be having to trawl through all this service-related data when it's not actually particular to what they do. You know, you can extrapolate that if a company's booking numbers have gone down or their trips have gone down, perhaps consumers aren't happy with them in a normal operating environment, or that competition has a particular effect. Yeah. But I've always been of the view that competition is the product of service quality. So if your numbers go down with increases in competition, that's because consumers are choosing to use another service provider in that space. But it's certainly a complex issue.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Craig.
Sure. Just while David was answering that question, Simon, Colin from Bendigo Taxi did have his hand up, but he's put it down now. So, Colin, it's okay if you don't have a question now, but if you do, feel free to ask it. But if there's silence, we'll know that it's been answered.
No, it was more, and I didn't want to flog a dead horse, but it was more around the dangers of relying on the information from the CPVV and making assessments based on that. It's probably worth noting that whilst things have improved just prior to COVID-19, the average wait time on the CPVV 1-800 number was around 10 to 12 minutes. So to say they've got less complaints, therefore service has improved, need not necessarily hold true. And that's across the board.
Thank you, Colin. For the minute, we don't have any more questions from the floor and no one's got their hand up, but happy to pause for 30 seconds if others are thinking about a question. Still no hands up, Simon, or questions from the floor there. So why don't we move on, and feel free though, participants, to, as we keep moving here, to put your hand up if a question comes to you.
So I suppose it's just for me to close the session. On behalf of the Commission, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us and participating in this public forum, and remind you of the next steps. Submissions on our draft decision are due by the 31st of July, and written feedback can be submitted via engage.vic.gov.au. Our final decision will be published on our website in early September. We'll also be sending out a short survey after this forum just to get some feedback on how you felt this public forum went and any suggestions on how we can improve it. The Commission hopes that you'll all stay safe and healthy through what is a very difficult time caused by the coronavirus pandemic. I know it's worrying for all of us, and I hope you'll stay safe, and thank you for participating today. It's been some really useful engagement from our perspective, so thank you again.